Hello and welcome to our coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Coming up today, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vows international pressure won't stop war against Hamas. Ismail Haniyeh, widely considered Hamas chief, says post-war Gaza without Hamas a delusion. Plus, Israel says video shows Hamas seizing a convoy of aid. Welcome to the program as it enters past the 67th day of conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. The Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, is saying nothing will stop Israel from continuing the war against Hamas, including international pressure. This was contained in a post on X. Speaking to soldiers at a military base in southern Israel, he reiterated that Israel will continue to the end until victory, until elimination of Hamas. An Israeli lawmaker is explaining that his government is seeking to use diplomatic channels to push Lebanon's Hezbollah fighters away from the border to avoid a war flaring up. Although an official close to the group says such ideas are unrealistic. While battling Hamas in Gaza, Israel has also been trading fire since October on the Lebanese frontier with Hezbollah, which, like the Hamas, is backed by Iran. The border violence is the worst since Israel and Hezbollah fought a month-long war back in 2006. Israel says Beirut will be turned into Gaza if Hezbollah starts another all-out war. Chairman of the Israeli Parliament Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, Mr. Yuli Edelstein, says Israel is determined to bring an end to Hezbollah's presence on the border with Israel.
Every normal country, be it United States, France, Arab countries, anyone who could somehow influence the situation and has some influence in Lebanon, whatever is left from Lebanese administration, Lebanese government, but still, definitely we are not running to open an additional front in the north. We will, if it will be necessary, if they will attack us, Hezbollah forces will attack us, and then we will have no choice. We can't get back to the situation where our communities, kibbutzim and other agricultural communities, are sitting half a mile from the border, half a mile from the fence, and one day could be attacked by, as I've said, the Hezbollah special forces. We're not going back to that situation. And Hezbollah terrorists in general, away from the border, this is, I think, a goal we are trying to reach at this stage through diplomatic channels. I won't go into tactical details, but we are definitely talking about miles. We are not talking about a couple of meters.
Meanwhile, Israel enjoys U.S. support for its goals of destroying Hamas and recovering hostages held by Hamas, but the allies differ about what might follow the Gaza war. That's according to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was speaking on Tuesday, reiterating his past refusal to countenance a return to Gaza rule of the Western-backed Palestinian Authority under President Mahmoud Abbas. Mr. Netanyahu said in a statement that Gaza will be neither Hamas nor Fatah stand. Fatah is Hamas's faction. A senior official for the Palestinian Authority insists that the comments made by the Prime Minister of Israel equating the Oslo Accords to what happened to October the 7th confirms his war against all Palestinians. A man considered widely to be the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, is opening up about his determination that any post-war arrangement in Gaza without Hamas will be a delusion. Ismail Haniyeh has said this in a televised address. In his words, he says, "We are open to discuss any ideas or initiatives that could end Israeli aggression and open the door for putting the Palestinian house in order both in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip." Hamas is proscribed as a terrorist organization in many countries, including the US and the UK. The health ministry in Gaza, which is controlled by Hamas, says that Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 19 people. According to the ministry, the strikes took place early this morning. Reacting to growing international calls for a ceasefire, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will continue fighting until Hamas is annihilated. Meanwhile, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has held talks with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman during a visit to Saudi Arabia. Discussions focused on the Israel-Hamas war and other regional issues, including efforts to deter the Houthi attacks against commercial vessels in the Red Sea. According to an official speaking anonymously, the pair discussed efforts to maintain stability across the region and prevent Israel-Hamas conflict from expanding. The official adds that Sullivan aimed to build on work already underway to try to create sustainable peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. The National Security Advisor is now expected to travel to Israel, where he will spend today and tomorrow holding talks with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and members of the war cabinet. Here, they're expected to discuss the need for Israel to be more surgical and precise with their strikes against Hamas targets. The United States thinks there's hope for normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's according to the White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby, who was speaking during a regular news briefing on Wednesday. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met on Wednesday with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi to discuss the Gaza conflict and other regional issues.
Before October 7th, our team was working very hard on normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which was going to be, we still think there's hope here, to be a stepping stone to get closer to a two-state solution. So we were very actively engaged in trying to set the parameters and set the conditions for a two-state solution going forward. Now, obviously, the events of October 7th have somewhat derailed that opportunity. Everybody's focused rightly on what's going on in Gaza, but that doesn't mean we're giving up on that.
Meanwhile, the Israeli Defense Ministry, body overseeing policy for the Palestinian territories, Kogats, has published a video which it says shows Hamas gunmen violently seizing a humanitarian aid convoy and shooting at civilians. The video shows hooded figures standing on the back of several lorries shooting at people as they drive past, although it's unclear what part of Gaza the video is filmed in. Israel just recently opened the Kerem Shalom goods crossing with Gaza on Tuesday, with 4 security checks on aid shipments delivered via Rafah. However, the UN says its ability to receive incoming aid is being significantly undermined by a shortage of lorries within Gaza, the lack of fuel, telecommunications blackouts, and the increasing number of staff unable to reach the Rafah crossing safely because of intensity of hostilities in the south. Aid distribution has also largely stopped outside the Rafah area because of the fighting. Israel has severely limited supplies of fuel, arguing that it could be stolen by Hamas and used for military purposes. We are now joined by senior lecturer, Anglia Ruskin University, London, Dr. Tony Agwans. Dr. Agwans is speaking virtually from the UK in London. Good morning and thank you for being with us.
Yeah, good morning, Olumide, and thanks for having me on your program this morning.
Given that Israel has stated that demilitarization of the Gaza Strip is a secondary objective of their present incursion, how feasible is a two-state solution when a standing army has to be part of any nation state?
Yeah, thank you very much, Olumide, and thanks for all your reports this morning. For Israel at the moment, I think their focus is on, like you rightly stated, is complete annihilation of the Hamas group. So that is their focus, and Israel is not budging with respect to having a ceasefire at this very time. So the Israel Defense Force, they want to completely, dislodge, Hamas military capability. So when you look at all the tactics that the Israelis have, deployed since they started the offensive in Gaza, is pointing towards that direction, even though they are very, very much under severe pressure now from their key ally, which is the United States of America.
Is a two-state solution still feasible, given they have a secondary objective of demilitarizing Gaza? That means no arms, no standing army after this war.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, the two-state solution is the permanent solution to this crisis. But I think the Israelis are just trying to, play hard to get, and they don't want to begin, discussions or peaceful negotiations with the Hamas group at this time, knowing fully well that what they have done in the last 8 weeks or thereabout, that this crisis began, has actually destroyed a lot of the Hamas military strength. So the Israelis are not thinking about that at the moment. But the only snag for Israel is that there's a lot of civilian casualties. So most nations, most of the Israeli allies, like the US, even France, Germany, the UK, they believe that if Israel is attacking the Hamas group like they've been doing, they should be able to, minimize the level of civilian death, especially women and children. So if they are going after Hamas, they do that, go into the tunnel like they've been doing. So, but the problem has been those, drone attacks and other, military incursion that the Israelis have been doing, which have been affecting the civilian population, which even the United Nations, a lot of nations who have been sympathetic to the Israeli cause are beginning to say, oh, hold on, this cannot continue because of the large-scale humanitarian crisis that we currently see in Gaza. But in the long term, the two-state solution, undermining what Israel is saying now, is the way to go. And for the Hamas, they also need to know that Israel deserves the right to, to exist as an independent nation.
Ismail Haniyeh, the Qatar-based Hamas leader, says that Gaza without Hamas is a delusion, and also that they are open to any ideas or initiatives that can end Israeli aggression. What possibly do you think he meant? Do you think also that that is open for discussion for the release of further hostages?
Yeah, I think for the Hamas group, when you look at from reports that we are reading about, the optics we are seeing, in the global media, they too know that they are losing the support of the ordinary Palestinians. You saw, I was watching your channel, recently, and I saw a lot of, Hamas militants, surrendering. We all saw that optics. So they are losing support because of the level of devastation currently that is happening in Gaza. So they too are also kind of midway, throwing in the olive branch. So that statement for me is the way to go. So nobody should be under the illusion that this crisis will just go on unending. The world cannot survive it. And like you said in your report just now, we saw the Houthi attacks from a group in Yemen on vessels in the Red Sea. So if this crisis is not properly handled, it can escalate. We see the Hezbollah on one side, and then we see the Iranians on the other side. So when you look at this triangle, I think everybody will understand that this needs to be nipped in the bud. This crisis must not be allowed to escalate, especially with those attacks that have already taken place in the Red Sea with those oil vessels. It could have huge economic implications for the entire world.
Speaking of the entire world, other countries have been chipping in their own 2 cents contributions, such as Russia, who have openly criticized the Israeli presence in Gaza, given that they themselves are invading and have invaded Russia. Isn't that preaching to the choir? That is, they have invaded
Exactly.
Ukraine. They've invaded Ukraine, I beg your pardon. So are they just preaching to the choir?
Exactly. In fact, I was listening to some analysts who were analyzing, this kind of statesmanship that Russia is trying to take in this Israel-Gaza conflict, and they said, "Come on, you have no local standing. You have done practically almost the same thing, and the entire United Nations body have been speaking resolution upon resolution. You didn't listen." So, yeah, Russia have been doing their bit, but they don't have the moral nexus, to really push that, because they too are, as we speak, they are still, on their offensive in Ukraine, which they want to annex. So that is the point. But I think we must give kudos to the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed ibn Salman. He's been doing a lot of diplomatic shuttle. The Qataris, the government of Qatar, they've done a lot, and we even got a report yesterday that they've sent away some the leaders of Hamas who have been, resident in Qatar for a very long time. We hear that those Hamas leaders have moved to Algeria. So I think the rest of the world, they've been, really pushing for peace, and with the U.S. Publicly, telling the Israelis that they need to, reduce their military offensive. I think that has sent a very strong message to the Israelis that they also need to change their strategy and go the way of peace.
If the other Arab nations surrounding Israel wanted to get involved, such as Lebanon, such as Jordan, by now, Syria, they would have, Iran, they would have been involved already on a wider scale, do you imagine? Do you reckon that the limited responses or curtailed responses or restrained responses from Hezbollah in Lebanon is indicative that no one really wants a full-out war and everyone really wants peace?
Yeah, you can see that no one really wants war, despite the show of chest and the show of force and all the hard talk that you hear from even Iran, you hear from the Hamas group, you hear from Hezbollah in Lebanon and all that. But you will know that everyone know that in terms of military capability, the Israelis are way ahead. And in international circles, nations size themselves up. They know each other's strength. Just like we say in business and economics, we talk about comparative advantage. So, in case of David and Goliath kind of scenario in the real sense. So all these groups that we've talked about, they know the military capability of Israel. So, and they know that this is not something they can win. And with the state of the world economy, they know that it's going to be really hard to push that, let's go to war, all-out war scenario. So I think that has, helped everyone to be on edge and not take this too far. But like we always say, when it comes to conflict, a day is like 1,000 years. Anything can happen.
Finally, how did you take the UN resolution of the General Assembly for the Israelis to withdraw from the Gaza Strip, and now Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, saying that nothing will deter their objective in routing Hamas?
Yeah, the UN resolution, 153 nations voting in favor, 10 voted against, it's like we have always said, when you look at the UN, they're just an organization that will always back, but never able to bite. In all crises, even when you look at the invasion of Iraq, those days, when you look at the current invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and then you look at this. So the UN, they will always come up with resolutions. They never really go anywhere. So nothing actually happens. And even the Security Council, when they voted, the Americans vetoed it. So nothing works. And the United Kingdom, they don't even vote, they abstained. So when you look at, for me, this crisis, I don't see the United Nations resolving it. The resolution may just probably come from, maybe the Saudi Arabia, the Qataris, actually doing the statesmanship. So for the United Nations, personally, I don't believe anything is going to come from them, because history has shown us that most of their resolutions, they are just mere pronouncement. It doesn't carry much weight.
We certainly pray that this time next year, we won't be talking about any of these two wars having not been concluded, either Israel, Hamas, or Ukraine and Russia. Thank you, Dr. Tony Agwin, Senior Lecturer, Anglo-Ruskin University in London, who joined us from there. Many thanks.
Thank you, Lumide. Have a great day.
You too. And still ahead. Gaza doctor warns it's impossible to prevent disease spread in the Strip. We'll have that story and more. After the break, please stay with us. You're watching Channels Television coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. The families of U.S. hostages held by Hamas believe President Joe Biden is doing everything he can to secure the release of their loved ones. According to them, the administration is completely committed to getting them home. The vote of confidence comes after a meeting with the families held with the president on Wednesday. This is the first in-person meeting family members of U.S. hostages have had with the president after his first virtual meeting in October. There are believed to be 8 Americans still held in Gaza. The head of the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, is denouncing Switzerland's move to cut aid as the Gaza Strip faces a humanitarian crisis described as apocalyptic by the United Nations. Switzerland's National Council, the lower house of the Federal Assembly, approved cutting an annual contribution of 20 million Swiss francs, equivalent to $22.83 million, to the agency by 116 to 78 votes on Monday. The initiative's author, who was part of a parliamentary delegation that visited the UNRWA earlier this year, has argued the agency lacked objectivity. The upper house is scheduled to assess the initiative today. Both houses have to approve for the proposal to be put in effect. Other UN bodies deplore the Swiss move. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, hopes Switzerland and other countries will continue to fund the agency. Established in 1949 following the first Arab-Israeli war, UNRWA provides services including schooling, primary health care and humanitarian aid in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria and Lebanon.
Despite our successes, UNRWA suffers from chronic underfunding, which impacts the quality of our services. Upholding refugees' rights is not only the responsibility of humanitarian and development actors, it is a responsibility shared with donors and host countries. It is unrealistic to think that people will remain resilient in the face of unlivable conditions of such magnitude, especially when the border is so close. Excellencies, I wrote to the President of the General Assembly last week, warning that UNRWA's ability to fulfill its mandate in Gaza is severely limited. The entire humanitarian response heavily relies on UNRWA's capacity. It is now on the verge of collapse.
I hope that everybody realizes now, unfortunately under tragic circumstances, how important UNRWA is, especially when an emergency like this. But not only an emergency, UNRWA provides education to 500,000 Palestinian children. UNRWA provides health services to millions of Palestinians. If UNRWA goes away and is not funded, the Palestinians that have already been so tragically penalized by history will be even more penalized.
A medical charity called Doctors Without Borders is imploring EU leaders to prevent further abhorrent bloodshed in Gaza ahead of a key meeting in Brussels. Doctors Without Borders, a charity that provides humanitarian medical assistance, reports on the platform X that they asked each EU leader to do whatever is in their power to protect the lives and dignity of Palestinians trapped in Gaza. They called on the EU's heads of state to exercise their unique position to convince Israel to stop what they call indiscriminate bombing of the Gaza Strip and protect people facing unimaginable horror. A European Council meeting which brings EU heads of state and government together will take place today and on Friday tomorrow. Disease is continuing to spread across the Gaza Strip, especially in overcrowded shelters. Director of the Mater Mohammed Yusuf Al-Hajar Hospital in the southern city of Rafah, Dr. Marwan Al-Ham, says this is inevitable. The hospital has 63 beds and is caring for 145 patients, some of whom lie on the hospital floor. Rafah is now home to around 1 million displaced Palestinians on top of the pre-war population of 300,000. Dr. Al-Ham says hospitals are receiving patients with severe diarrhea, fatigue, and high temperature. There are also high rates of bacterial infection and skin diseases. Medicine to treat such conditions is rare to find. Food poisoning is another concern, linked to the lack of fresh drinking water, spread of water contaminated with sewage around displacement camps. Our next guest is National Security Risk Strategist and also a former British police officer, Mr. Vince Oyekwelu, who is speaking to us from southeast Nigeria, Anambra State to be precise. Good morning and thank you for making out the time to be with us.
Good morning, Olumide. Good morning, Nigeria.
From our last story, you see the depiction of the challenge, humanitarian catastrophe that is happening in the Gaza Strip, not to talk of the fear of shells or mortar or fire from the Israeli IDF, but now the real and present danger of an epidemic and disease that the Palestinians in Gaza are facing. What are your thoughts?
It's very touching. It's a catastrophe, and every good-thinking human being would have compassion and pity on the Palestinians that are going through all these. However, we understand that whenever war is a situation, that there are going to be casualties. There are casualties on the sides of the Palestinians. There are also casualties on the sides of the Israelis. And there are also serious casualties on the Bedouins and the other foreigners that have been killed in this situation or have been harmed. We also have to understand, just like we discussed last time, that the Palestinian citizens who are uninvolved. Now, we need to be very careful how we use our terms, because so far I am concerned, and I will say that with authority, that Hamas is a terrorist organization, a very deadly, brutal, violent terrorist organization. And when you're dealing with terror, terrorists have this love to always get human beings to be involved. So they can use their propaganda very well that human beings and civilians are being affected. So we have to use a new term called involved civilians and uninvolved civilians. The involved civilians are those civilians, Palestinians, that are not Hamas members, but are highly connected to Hamas terrorist organization, that are highly sympathetic to the Hamas terrorist organization, that actually give information and allow terrorist Hamas to hide in their cubicles, in their houses. These are the involved Palestinian citizens. Now there are the uninvolved, the innocent, who obviously not being involved will be open to harassment because Hamas is in charge, is the political party in charge of Gaza. So they have the Ministry of Health run by Hamas, Ministry of Finance run by Hamas terrorists, Every ministry in Gaza is run by Hamas terrorists. So the uninvolved are the ones we should have pity on, not the involved. All over the world, the IDF has to do much, much, much more to see that uninvolved citizens are given the best support. However, we've had situations where the Hamas terrorist organizations try to use every death of uninvolved citizens to be a strategy to win the war, whereas it has to be seen as a tragedy, not as a strategy. So that's what happens when you deal with terrorist organizations. Hamas is not the military arm of Palestine government. They are a terrorist organizations that we should be very careful about, because there could be copycats across the world that wish to learn from Hamas terrorism strategies to deploy the same thing in various countries of the world. Thank you.
They have been designated a terrorist organization at the United Nations by at least 26 countries because they met the parameters that led that to be so. Could you, however, then possibly point out your view on the other side of the spectrum who consider Hamas as freedom fighters, fighting against the oppressive, aggressive Israeli regime, in their words?
Beautiful question. Yes, in the other perspective, people can see an organization like Hamas, which are called repeatedly a terrorist, violent, wicked organization. Now, if you want to act as a resistance organization, in the ANC South Africa, we saw how the ANC worked as a resistance organization when they were fighting apartheid in South Africa. We saw the Biafran people when they were fighting the Nigerian Civil War, how they work as a resistance movement. None of them worked as a terrorist organization that will openly speak that unbelievers that do not believe in their ideology should be beheaded, that their hearts should be plucked out from their hearts, that fetuses of babies should be brought out from their mothers. That is vicious, that is wicked, that is not resistance. We've seen how other countries of the world have fought resistance against an oppressive regime. I am not exonerating the Israelis from not having some level of deployment that can be seen as the territorial, dictatorial suppression, oppression. I'm not going to speak that, because I know that there are actions that the Israeli military and the Israeli regime has taken on Palestinians that are not fair, are totally wrong, and must be condemned by any fair-thinking person across the world. However, as I speak to you, that I don't support all the actions that the Israelis have taken against the uninvolved citizens of Palestine, from the East Jerusalem to the West Bank to Gaza. Those are totally wrong, and they should have a rethink. However, Hamas is not a resistant movement. Hamas is a vicious, wicked organization that sees an unbeliever has a right to be beheaded, murdered, killed just because you don't believe in their faith or you don't believe in their feelings. That is not resistance. That was not what they did in Biafra during the Nigerian Biafra crisis. That was not what they did in ANC during the South African apartheid fight, and across the world. What Hamas is a terrorist, vicious, wicked organization. They are not a resistant organization, and they can never be one, because they are wicked and callous and vicious. Thank you.
If this was a world of fiction over fact, and we're at the movies and it's Hollywood or Nollywood or Bollywood, probably special forces will have galloped in to save the day. Maybe the SAS, the Green Beret, the special forces of Israel, or the people who are taking hostage their nationals, their countries. But the fact that 67 days after they were kidnapped, the hostages have still not been rescued, and we don't hear how there's any progress being made by the countries concerned, especially Israel, who have the majority of the hostages, over 100 hostages still in captivity. Nothing as far as special forces attempting to rescue them. Obviously, it'll be secret, but even if they've tried, they've not succeeded.
Yeah, exactly. You have to understand the terrain. The terrain in northern Gaza and the terrain in southern Gaza, they are very unique. in warfare, when you are fighting organized criminals like Hamas terrorist organizations, you don't copy and paste. Northern Gaza is unique. The underground tunnels happens to be one of the best in modern warfare, and you cannot bring special forces that do not understand the terrain, that have not fought on the ground. When you have fought over ground, it's a different warfare. When you fight on the ground, you are highly exposed to booby traps, to IDEs. So it's very difficult for foreign nationals to deploy their special forces to come into Gaza to try to rescue their nationals. So I think it's best left in the hands of the Israeli IDF, obviously in partnership with interested nations that have the capability of fighting on the ground. The IDF understands the terrain more than any other person in any other army in the world. Even the US soldiers don't have understanding of the terrain. Then when it comes to hostages that have been taken, I think I have to concur to your ideas. After 67 days, majority of the hostages their whereabouts are unknown. And I keep asking the IDF this question. Those that were released last week or in the past period of, where did they emerge from? Did they emerge from outside the borders of Gaza? Did they emerge from the seas? Did they emerge from the blue sky? Or did they come out from the underground? If it's same underground they came out from, that means IDF has a lot more work to do, because that underground tunnel is more versatile than what IDF thought it is. Because it's believed that the last two people that were released in the past 24 that died, that their bodies were found. One of them was found, was kidnapped at the Nova Music Festival, and the other one, that 36-year-old, was also part of those that were kidnapped on the 7th of October. So it shows that when their bodies have been found, most of them are possibly in either northern Gaza, and possibly many of them have been migrated to southern Gaza, even to the borders of Egypt. So obviously there is work to be done, because the underground tunnel holds more magic, and it's only this time around that it can be kind of deactivated to understand what's going on there. Thank you.
Yeah, we understand that 50 meters below the ground, some aspects of this subterranean complex, that is the underground tunnels underneath Gaza, that Hamas have been able to build. And it's obviously a very difficult challenge for the IDF. But when we look at the suffering that continues in Gaza, and the Palestinians that are suffering in Gaza, and the death that is going on, and the medical challenge that is going on, and the hostages situation that remain, is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Because of what Ismail Haniyeh has recently said, as we quoted earlier on in the program, that they are open to initiatives and ideas that will help to end the Israeli aggression. Is there a sliver of hope somewhere that maybe now, because of the bombardments, is beginning to, there might be some further negotiations?
Honestly speaking, there is this failure on the side of the Israelis. They have been seriously and overpowering with their propaganda. There is hope in the end of the tunnel, because the United Nations are getting more involved. There has been so many allegations that put the United Nations in a very negative light, when most of their complexes or their facilities around them has been used by the terrorist organization Hamas to launch missiles against Israelis. Israelis on their own has been very poorly with their propaganda. They waffle, they say things that are wishy-washy. They actually get caught up in things that are not the truth, in where they have used AI images to do their propagandas. You cannot expect such poorly behavior from professional soldiers. However, in the past 7 days, probably after the ceasefire ended, there has been a more organized structure of the Israeli propaganda. As I said to you before, the Hamas terrorist organization has been winning the war on propaganda, and up to date, they are still winning that war of propaganda. However, you have to understand that the Israelis now have changed their strategies, whereby they now drop leaflets across Gaza to advise people to leave, and they have opened corridors where people can move from any particular time of the day to safety. and they will always use radio now and even direct telephone calls to Gazans residents to advise them directly and speaking Arab and writing leaflets in Arabic. So they need to do more, because right now the picture is that when even if you kill a Hamas soldier, Hamas will turn the propaganda around that the person that you killed is not Hamas terrorist, that it's actually an innocent citizen. So you will have to expect much. The UN has been found wanting in many ways, because when their properties are used to launch strikes against Israel, they don't seem to speak up, but they only kind of choose to speak, seeing Israel as the aggressors, but not seeing Hamas as a terrorist organization that is using UN or UNRWA facilities. When you hear about that narrative about about UNRWA, the work UNRWA is doing, I'm asking United Nations, how come there's no UNRWA in northern Sudan? Where is UNRWA? Where is the UN in southern Sudan, where there is in northern Sudan, where there's ongoing current war? How come the UN is focused only in Gaza and the Palestinians? There's an ongoing current war in northern Sudan. How come there's no UN there giving analysis? How come there's no UNRWA over there helping refugees of war, helping casualties of war? Must the UN only focus on Palestinians? And you have to know, in the past 10, 15 years, certain fundamentalists, I'm talking about information on the ground, has been able to force their colleagues to infiltrate the ranks and file of the United Nations and UNRWA. So at times, you see that there's a bit of bias by the UNRWA against the Israelis, and that's why currently Israel has got no respect for UNRWA. Israel has got no respect for the United Nations. So UN cannot really do much, right, because Israel don't trust UN anymore. So UN has to make themselves to be trusted. So this light at the end of the tunnel can shine better and brighter to stop this war and stop civilians, uninvolved civilians, from being killed. We have to use the term uninvolved, because some civilians are criminals, some of the civilians are terrorists. They pretend to be civilians in the morning, whereas they're terrorists in the night. So we have to be very careful. The word uninvolved and involved civilians has to be introduced. Thank you.
Lastly, to be factual, UNRWA also has presence in other locations outside Gaza, such as Syria. But do you think that the isolation that the US and Israel are now facing of the United Nations, which Russia faced also at the United Nations, tends to drive a wedge further between the objectives of the United Nations and the international community and those countries with which they have a problem?
Honestly, in the UN, the United States are having serious challenges based on the current resolutions. But across the world, there's this new deep sense of realization. Example, what's going on in Argentina, that the new elected president of Argentina is taking a brand new stance that hasn't been unheard in Argentina against a fundamentalist. And the same thing is happening in, I think it's in Netherlands, that the new gentleman that won the post in Netherlands as a new president of Netherlands is taking a new stand. Look at what's happening in the UK, a new stance on immigration policies. The same thing happening in France, a new stance on immigration policies. Because look at what happened in Ireland, in Dublin, 3 weeks ago, where a gentleman saying some comments, I don't want to say the comment here because of diplomatic reason, and killed 3 young girls. So the world over are beginning to shift their mindset about migration and immigration. And obviously, whatever happens in the UN is not the world. The world is about countries of the world taking policies about immigration. Look at the reason why the UK left the EU. It has to do with one of these issues about forcing Belgium, which happens to be the seat of power in the EU, forcing countries of the EU to take refugees, whether you like it or not. One of the reasons that UK left the EU, the Union, and today UK are even making it known that from 2024, you cannot bring your dependents to the UK anymore. If you're working for the social services or the healthcare services, they want to change the narrative. If you're earning £18,600 in a year, in a month, you cannot bring your family member, be it your husband or your children. You have to now earn times 2 of that, about 7,000 GBP every month. So it shows that the countries of the world are beginning to change their mindset about fundamentalists, about people that run away from their countries because they don't have freedom of speech. They now come to new countries and they want to force you not to have freedom of speech in your country. People that will say, behead, kill somebody because of their religion. You've got no right to kill anybody because of the way they wish to worship God Almighty. Just like the way I speak my own language, you speak your own language. The same way I worship my own God, the way I knew it, the way my ancestors taught me. Not for you to tell me that if I don't worship your God, you behead me. No, you get beheaded first of all before you behead anybody. Because anybody can be violent if they choose to be. Thank you.
Well, transnational migration and immigration, as well as liberal, conservative, religious issues remain very, very controversial around the world. We thank you so much for your contribution this morning, Mr. Vince Oyekwelu, National Security Risk Advisor and former British police officer who joined us from Anambra State. Many thanks.
Thank you. Merry Christmas in advance.
Merry Christmas in advance. That's the first Merry Christmas in advance I've heard. Same to you. Still to come on the program, Madrid protesters donate shoes to remember Palestinian lives lost in Gaza. More details later. Please join us again. Welcome back. Pro-Palestinian protesters shut down an expressway in Los Angeles, the USA, as they call for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. The protesters stood in the road and later sat down on the road, forming a human chain on the road and blocking traffic along the highway in the road for about an hour. About 75 people were detained, according to the California Highway Patrol. And hundreds of Madrid protesters laid shoes in front of Madrid City Hall to represent thousands of Palestinians killed in Israel's onslaught on Gaza since October the 7th. They organized the protest to denounce the city's mayor's decision to award Israel Madrid's Medal of Honor last October after Hamas attacked southern Israel, killing 1,200 and taking more than 240 people hostage. Gaza's health ministry is now saying at least 18,608 people have been killed and over 50,500 injured in Israeli retaliatory strikes on Gaza. Thousands more are feared lost in the rubble or beyond the reach of ambulances. Spain, Ireland, Belgium, Malta want EU leaders to debate the situation in Gaza and have jointly called for a lasting humanitarian ceasefire that would end the conflict. And that ends this broadcast of Israel-Hamas war coverage this morning. Please stay with us throughout the day for more news. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a good day.